Hi there, I'm Tracy Smith, and this is Here Comes the Sun, a closer look at some of the people, places, and things we bring you every weekend on Sunday morning. Delia Ephron is the force behind some of our most beloved books and romantic comedies. The story of her own life reads more like a tragedy, with the loss of her husband, her sister, and for a time, her health. But her latest chapter has a much happier ending, as she tells Dr. Jon LaPook.
Delia coped with her grief by writing about it in a darkly funny 2016 New York Times editorial about disconnecting her late husband's landline.
I absolutely hate Verizon. I spent 4 hours on the phone with them on a recent Saturday morning. I know for sure I was disconnected 3 times.
Soon she got an email from Dr. Peter Rutter, who reminded her they'd gone on a date 54 years earlier, set up by, who else? Nora.
What was it about the Verizon article that made you reach out to Delia?
She was single.
But you had remembered her all these years?
Oh, of course. Who forgets an Efron girl? You are enjoying yourself.
Soon, Peter and Delia were an item. At the same time, at Weill Cornell Medicine, New York Presbyterian, Delia's blood tests were being monitored at regular intervals by Dr. Gail Robos. It was a cautionary measure because of Nora's leukemia.
In March of 2017, she comes in, she has a blood test, and she was almost getting ready to get up and go. And something flashed on the review of the blood smear. And I went to take a look, and all of a sudden there's acute leukemia.
More exclusive excerpts from that conversation coming up a little later in the show.
In movies, there's an expression, meeting cute.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means that 2 people who are going to fall in love have their first encounter, and it's the beginning of romantic comedy, is the meet cute. But then the most important thing about a romantic comedy is, why can't 2 people be together?
Your courtship unfolded with an exchange of emails. Do you see a parallel between that and You've Got Mail?
Yes, I love that movie. I love that my wife and her sister co-wrote it. We did it better.
Then David Pogue takes us to an old barn in Connecticut, where a man's trash quickly turned into treasure.
When Jared and his friend George Martin arrived at the barn, they found
a giant 40-yard dumpster full of art, jam-packed with art from front to back.
Every piece you see is individually thick plastic with dust and dirt.
But as they unwrapped the paintings, something clicked.
And I'm just like, man, this stuff, who is this guy?
Were there signatures on
There's
them?
signatures on every one. F. Hines.
That's all coming up right here on Here Comes the Sun. You might know Delia Ephron from the stories she creates as a best-selling novelist and an award-winning screenwriter. But now she's sharing her own real-life story of tremendous loss and new love with our Dr. Jon LaPook.
Good girl. Come on, Charlotte.
Author Delia Ephron knows a thing or two about romantic storylines, and lately, she's been living one.
If you were to summarize what happened to you over the last few years and pitch it to a movie studio, what do you think the response would be?
I think they would buy it.
And she would know.
Do you think we should meet?
She and her sister Nora co-wrote the 1998 classic rom-com, You've Got Mail.
Meet? Oh my God.
Suddenly, love lands on me. It's so amazing to fall in love, and how lucky that I got to.
But before luck came grief. Delia lost Nora in 2012, and her husband Jerome Cass just 3 years later, both to forms of cancer.
Every time I came home, he wasn't there to schmooze about every single thing in the world. And yet he was everywhere, wasn't he?
Delia coped with her grief by writing about it in a darkly funny 2016 New York Times editorial about disconnecting her late husband's landline.
I absolutely hate Verizon. I spent 4 hours on the phone with them on a recent Saturday morning. I know for sure I was disconnected 3 times.
Soon she got an email from Dr. Peter Rutter, who reminded her they'd gone on a date 54 years earlier, set up by, who else? Nora.
Part of the amazingness of getting that first email was that he said that Nora had set us up. I mean, I just couldn't believe it. It was like she was reaching down to me.
What was it about the Verizon article that made you reach out to Delia?
She was single.
But you had remembered her all these years?
Oh, of course. Who forgets an Ephron girl? You are enjoying yourself.
Soon, Peter and Delia were an item. At the same time, at Weill Cornell Medicine, New York Presbyterian, Delia's blood tests were being monitored at regular intervals by Dr. Gail Robos. It was a cautionary measure because of Nora's leukemia.
Every 6 months I would go in to see Dr. Robos, and she would take my blood, and she would say something like, "This is the most boring blood I've seen all day," and send me off.
Dr. Robos is director of Weill Cornell Medicine's leukemia program. Delia's results continued to be boring for 8 years. But then,
In March of 2017, she comes in, she has a blood test, and she was almost getting ready to get up and go. And something flashed on the review of the blood smear. And I went to take a look, and all of a sudden there's acute leukemia.
When you saw that, what was your reaction? Do you remember?
I think I wanted to run away. The shock of this, I gotta tell you, it's a gut punch for us, and it's a gut punch to the patient.
I spoke with Dr. Robos, and she said when she realized that you had leukemia and she needed to tell you that, she wanted to run away.
Oh my goodness. Oh my goodness. Oh. My God.
Delia writes about the diagnosis in her new memoir, Left on 10th.
As she is sitting there, the rest of the results come in. Results that leave no doubt I have leukemia. I don't remember her telling me. I only remember suddenly knowing it.
She's going from feeling fine to this awful news, coming in the hospital, catheter in her arm, chemotherapy. It's absolutely an unbelievable sort of 180 in one's life.
But that 180 was, for Delia and Peter, a reason to take the next step.
Peter and I were having breakfast on Sunday, and I was making French toast. And he suddenly stands up and says, "Will you marry me?" I mean, the sweetest. It was so sweet. And I said yes.
To have and to hold, to love and to cherish.
And we got married in the hospital, in the dining room on the 14th floor, with just a very few friends. And you were there.
Yes, I was there. As Delia's longtime friend, capturing the whole thing on video.
There I had the hospital band on my wrist and the flowers in my other hand.
And the wedding band on the other.
And the wedding band, yeah, exactly. There was just such a kind of amazing disconnect. And yet at the same time, it was just very loving.
With her new husband by her side, Delia tackled chemotherapy and then a stem cell transplant.
You go to see your transplant doctor, and what does he say to you?
He says, basically, I have a 20% chance of survival. And I said, but we just fell in love. I don't know why I said that, because obviously it was absolutely irrelevant, right? But I guess in my head, I wanted him to know this mattered.
She says love is what kept her going. But the transplant took its toll, and she was having trouble breathing. So she said to Dr. Robos,
"Please come and see me." And I said, "I just want out. I can't take it anymore." And
She was calling in people and asking for that end-of-life conversation. So I was mentally scrambling for what would be a way to handle this.
And she said, this is so brilliant. She said, "Give me 48 hours. And if I get somewhere, give me another 48. So she gave me hope and an end game in one sentence.
I didn't want her to give up. I thought she'd be okay.
48 hours later, her breathing began to improve. Today, 4 years later, there is no evidence of leukemia on any test. And she is still very much in love.
When something like this happens, where everything fits in some way that is just extraordinary, it just makes you wonder about life.
There's more from their talk coming up in just a few minutes. Up next, a mechanic's task turns into a beautiful discovery.
It's a small painting from 1961, and it said, Francis Hines.
The old adage, someone's trash is someone else's treasure, happens to be true for a Connecticut man who stumbled across millions of dollars worth of art. David Pogue has the story.
Jared Whipple is a skateboarder and a mechanic in Connecticut. In 2017, he got a call from a contractor buddy who'd been hired to clean out an old barn.
And he just said, Jared, nobody's been in there in like 40 years.
When Jared and his friend George Martin arrived at the barn, they found
a giant 40-yard dumpster full of art, jam-packed with art from front to back.
Every piece you see is individually thick plastic with dust and dirt.
But as they unwrapped the paintings, something clicked.
And I'm just like, man, this stuff, who is this guy?
Were there signatures on
There's
them?
signatures on every one. F. Hines. So we're Googling, and nothing's coming up. Nothing.
Finally, a lucky break.
It's a small painting from 1961, and it said Francis Hines. So now we have a whole name.
Yeah.
All right, here we go. Mr. Google. Mr. Google, where are we at?
Mr. Google revealed that in 1980, artist Francis Hines had wrapped New York's Washington Square Arch in fabric.
At that point, it's like, this guy's famous. Why is it in the dumpster? Can't figure it out.
Jared became consumed by the mystery of Francis Hines.
I was obsessed with the research every day, whether I'm at work, whether I'm home.
The first breakthrough was an old book he found on eBay.
And it was a treasure trove. It was a biography. It was his family. It was his friends.
It turned out that Hines was born in 1920, grew up in Cleveland, served in World War II, and became an illustrator for department store ads.
Francis Hines had his 15 minutes of fame in 1980 when he wrapped the Washington Square Arch.
Peter Hastings Falk is an art historian and publisher.
He did JFK Terminal. He was in the Port Authority bus station. He stands distinctly as the only artist to ever wrap a building in New York.
Almost every piece of Hines' artwork involves
tension. And all of the energy occurs within that tension.
But then Francis Hines disappeared.
Francis really retired to his studio, essentially. He cared about one thing, creating every day.
I just love the process of making art.
So he would create all this art in New York and then truck it to the barn, because that was his storage facility, and just keep filling it and filling it and filling it and just forgetting about it.
Hines died in 2016 at age 96, but Jared was determined to resurrect his reputation. He began calling New York art galleries.
I got so many doors shut in my face.
Is this a snob thing?
I don't know what. Maybe I got a wrong etiquette. I'm a little old school, and I'm blue collar.
Finally, he met Peter Hastings Falk, who agreed to help.
I was really impressed. I mean, I was blown away by the originality that I saw.
Is there value to these paintings?
Yes, it's well into the millions of dollars once all is said and done.
In May, the Hollis Taggart Gallery will exhibit the dumpster treasures in Southport, Connecticut. They're likely to sell for over $20,000 a piece. And by agreement with the Hines family, most of the art belongs to Jared Whipple.
Do you feel like the art world is finally taking you seriously?
The art world right now is taking me more seriously than I ever imagined in my life. I'm a undereducated skateboarding mechanic, you know? I can't even wrap my head around it.
It's happening fast now.
Maybe Francis could wrap my head around it. But I can't wrap my head around it.
You know, of course I Googled him, but the first thing I did. And
What'd you find?
After the break, more from Delia Ephron and her husband, Dr. Peter Rutter. Stay with us. Welcome back. As promised, here's more from Dr. Jon LaPook's conversation with Delia Ephron and Dr. Peter Rutter.
You come from a family of writers.
Yes.
And there was an expression I know that you had in your family, which was?
Yes, everything is copy.
Which means?
Which means that when awful things happen to you, you get to write about them and make them your story. And I did. And I believe everybody who goes through a big trauma, if you can dance it, draw it, paint it, write it, do something with it, it will help you. So the writing helped me with the trauma.
So Jerry dies, and you're trying to disconnect your Verizon line.
Yes. I was trying to disconnect his landline, and for some reason, Verizon disconnected my internet at the same time. So it's very irritating. So I did what I do, you know, I wrote about it. I wrote a very funny piece and also a sad piece about losing Jerry and being in a rage at Verizon. And
it was for the New York Times, right?
Yes, it was an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was quite popular. It turns out half the world has trouble disconnecting their late spouse's phones. And about 6 months later, I get an email from Peter. You know, of course I Googled him, but the first thing I did. And
What'd you find?
I found out that he was an expert in sexual harassment and that he'd written 2 books on it, which was kind of stunning. It was like a feminist prank almost, and I couldn't believe it. And then suddenly, love lands on me, and romance. I mean, really, really romance. Just as great as it was when I was in my 30s when I met Jerry. It was just, it's just magical. It's so amazing to fall in love, and how lucky that I got to.
In movies, there's an expression, meeting cute.
Yes.
What does that mean?
It means that 2 people who are going to fall in love have their first encounter, and it's the beginning of romantic comedy, is the meet cute. But then the most important thing about a romantic comedy is, why can't 2 people be together? Tom and Megan, you've got male meet in the bookshop, and then it turns out that he's trying to put that bookshop out of business because he owns the equivalent of Barnes & Noble. So that's why they can't be together, because he's putting her out of business. But they have had a meet cute, which means they're meant for each other.
Did the 2 of you meet cute?
I wrote Delia an email. I waited 3 days to see whether I'd get a reply, and then I get this amazing reply where she says I had talked about hiking. She says I only hike across Greenwich Village to my favorite bakery. But you knew Nora. How did that happen? I don't remember you, but I looked you up, and did you write this book? And how did that subject find its way to your heart? People say, what got you interested in this? How did you find this subject? Nobody had ever said anything about the heart. And here Delia is going right for my heart. And I finished that email, and I said out loud, which I'm not prone to speak when nobody else is in the room, Beschert.
Beschert, meant to be.
Meant to be, by some uncanny religious or not religious force.
Delia, what took you 3 days to respond to Peter's first email?
I think I just waited 3 days because I felt embarrassed to answer immediately. And also, I did some revisions.
I see.
Yes.
It's always the rewrite.
I did a draft, and then I saved it, and then I read it the next day and made some changes. I still think it's too long for
It wasn't too long for me. I loved every word. And it ended with the word heart. And that Delia didn't remember me from 54 years before, that was good for me, because it wasn't so cute back then. This was pure cute, and there was no reason we couldn't be together, except, oh, leukemia.
Yeah, that's the reason in our romance we can't be together. Because I'm dying.
And yet?
And yet I don't.
And
so
yet
like
here
all
we are.
good romantic comedies.
Think of all the things that had to happen in order for the 2 of you to get together. I would think there's part of that could be terrifying. Think like, oh my gosh, the odds of this happening were close to 0.
It doesn't feel terrifying at all. It feels like coming home to a sort of destiny. The only thing that would be terrifying is losing it.
I was terrified.
How so?
Because I had been through so much loss, and I thought, well, we're going to fall in love, and I could just think one of us is going to go through this again. And so I just got really scared. That's why falling in love when you're older is both, I mean, it's great because you've solved so many things in your life. You're not trying to have a career at the same time. You're not trying to have children. You're not, you're not struggling with all the things you want to become and what's going to happen to you. You know who you are. So that's the great part. But you also know your time is short.
So your courtship unfolded with an exchange of emails. Do you see a parallel between that and You've Got Mail?
Yes, I love that movie. I love that my wife and her sister co-wrote it. We did it better.
I'm Tracy Smith. Thanks for joining us. We'll see you here next time on Here Comes the Sun.